Hello, this is Shannon Kleibrink, and you are listening to the Future of Curling Masterclasses presented by Curling Canada with support from the World Curling Federation's Development Assistance Program. In this episode, we explore equity, diversity, and inclusion, what they are and how they are all interconnected, and we learn about bias, privilege, and best practices when working with historically marginalized communities. This masterclass is presented by Andrew Paris. Andrew Paris, he/him, is a collaborator at Inclusion Incorporated, as well as the coaching lead for equity, diversity, inclusion, and mentorship with the Canadian Sport Institute Atlantic and the founder of the Black Rock Initiative. Andrew is working hard to create opportunities for BIPOC youth to try the sport of curling, while also providing curling clubs with the tools and resources necessary to be a welcoming and inclusive facility to their entire community.
Hey folks, what's going on? My name is Andrew Paris, and not only am I a curler, but I'm also an inclusion consultant based in Toronto, Nova Scotia. So let's get into it. We know that the rocks don't discriminate. The ice doesn't discriminate. But sometimes as people, we do discriminate. Often it's unintentional. I don't think curlers are racist. I don't think all curlers are sexist. I don't think all curlers are homophobic. But my job today is to help you move forward in this equity, diversity, and inclusion space in a meaningful way. Simply put, I'm here to help you navigate the WTF of inclusion. Why does this issue matter? Take action and see what you can do about it, and find help through supports and other resources such as myself. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that our facilities and the work that I do takes place within the traditional territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from coast to coast to coast. As a settler, I am thankful to live, work, and play here. As privileged advocates and agents of change, we need to recognize that we all have the responsibility to work towards truth and reconciliation and remain open to consultations, especially with local Indigenous communities, on how we can repair harm and restore balance. But here's the thing with land acknowledgements. They're just merely words, and words alone do not create change. So my first challenge to you is, how do we take the words of a land acknowledgement and put them into action? I encourage you, every time you hear a land acknowledgement, that should follow with an action leading towards a better relationship with our Indigenous friends. So my first challenge to you today is to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action specifically related to sport and find out how many of them can we implement within our curling club or curling facility. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the difference between non versus anti. We're going to talk about what is equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about our bias and our privilege, as well as what is allyship, and some different things to consider when working with historically marginalized communities. But before we get into it, just a word of note. A lot of times when we do this type of unlearning, when we start to think about concepts that challenge our previous ways of thinking, they can sometimes feel uncomfortable. We want to get comfortable being uncomfortable. A lot of times in my day job at the Canadian Sport Institute Atlantic, I work with coaches. And coaching at its core is working with athletes to have them step outside their comfort zone and then in turn learn a new skill and then become a better athlete. I encourage you today to take time to step outside your comfort zone and become a better leader, not only for your curling club or facility, but for your entire community. So, what is the difference between non versus anti? Let's look at it from this lens. Let's pretend for a moment somebody comes in and they talk about how, as a black person, I'm not suited to be delivering such a presentation because perhaps they believe that white people are smarter than black people. Well, if nobody says anything towards that derogatory and racist behavior, then through our silence, we're being implicit. We're saying that that type of behavior is okay. That's the difference between being non-racist and anti-racist. And as a side note, we can replace that word racist with homophobic, with sexist, all kinds of different isms, if you will. It means more than being just a good person. It means using our privilege to speak up and say that behavior is not okay. Or perhaps it's showing empathy to the person on the receiving end of the racist or discriminatory behavior. Going up to somebody and asking, I saw what happened, are you okay? That goes a long way towards being anti-racist or anti-homophobic. And once we go from being more than just a good person, once we go to being anti, that's when we can create real change within our curling facilities. So that's an important piece to remember right off the top. So my hope today is to give you some tools, give you some resources, give you some opportunity to reflect on your journey from going from non to anti. Before we dive into some learnings, I want you to think for just a moment. Perhaps you're with your friends, perhaps you're alone watching this on your computer. I want you to think back to a moment when you felt included, or perhaps a time you felt excluded. In that moment, how did you feel? We want curling to be a place where everybody feels included, but we have to remember, no matter what your background, no matter what you look like, we all come into this space and place with what I like to refer to as the invisible backpack. Perhaps something happened to us earlier in the day. Perhaps we got into a car accident and we're really shaken up. Perhaps we were racially profiled when in the grocery store. Perhaps somebody threw a homophobic slur our way. All of that baggage is added into that invisible backpack. And what we really want is for curling to be a sport where we can take off that invisible backpack for a couple of hours, where we can take off that invisible backpack for the bonspiel, where anybody and everybody can show up and be their authentic self. I truly believe that that's what curling can provide. And that's ultimately why I'm talking to you today. My personal why is I started doing this work about 5 years ago to create spaces and places where my biracial son and my bisexual daughter can show up and be their authentic self. I truly believe that anybody can do this if we come into this space and place with an open mind and be willing to learn. So with that said, let's get into some terminology. Let's start with talking about diversity. So diversity by definition is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and or different genders, sexual orientations, etc., etc. Now, I tend to stay away from dictionary definitions. The only time I look at the dictionary is when I want to toss in my daughter's way so she can put a sentence together in school. Here's the thing about diversity though. You can be unintentionally diverse. If we look into spaces and places where we work, perhaps the spaces and places where we go to the grocery store, we have men, we have women, we have short men, we have tall men, we have men and women from different ages. But your local grocery store didn't do anything intentional to be diverse. It's a place you go to get groceries, or it's a place you work. You can be unintentionally diverse. And the thing about being unintentionally diverse is, in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't really count. In my job, I'm often asked from different provincial sport organizations, hey Andrew, I want to make my sport, whether it's hockey, whether it's volleyball, whether it's basketball, I want to make my sport more diverse. But we're asking the wrong question. What you want to do is you want to make your sport more inclusive. So let's get into that. Let's talk about inclusion. Inclusion is the effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are socially accepted and welcomed. Inclusion is being intentional. Inclusion is the work. So let's think about this a little bit more, for example. Often in our spaces, we have a code of conduct, and within that code of conduct, we talk about perhaps racism and discrimination isn't tolerated. But we don't define either of those terms and we don't talk about why. So perhaps, just as an example, being more inclusive means creating an inclusion statement. It doesn't have to be super long, but it dives into a bit more of the why racism and discrimination aren't tolerated, and it creates not only a safer space for individuals to belong, but it also allows everybody to show up easier and be their true and authentic self. But here's the thing about inclusion. It's important to remember that inclusion isn't a marketing campaign. Inclusion isn't about reaching out to that Indigenous community and selling our sport to them. It's not about reaching out to Black Canadians and selling our sport to them. Inclusion is about changing our spaces and places to make them inclusive for everybody, to make sure that everybody feels that sense of belonging. Now, let's talk about equality and equity. As we hop into that, let me tell you a little bit of a story. So, my son has an additional resource provided to him because he's African Nova Scotian. It's called an African Nova Scotian Student Support Worker. One day when he was in grade 5, he came home with a laptop in his backpack. Now, listen, being in grade 5, there's any number of ways that that laptop ended up in his backpack. So I said to him, Elijah, where'd you get that laptop from? And he said, well, my student support worker gave it to me. Still equally confused. I said, why? He said, well, the teacher was talking to our principal, and he said that all the brown students in our school needed a laptop at home so that they could make sure that they got all their homework done. Elijah didn't need a laptop in order to succeed. Now, that's not to say that our family is filthy rich and that he has access to all the resources and anything and everything that he needs. But that was looking at a solution from a lens of equality. So equality means providing everyone the same amount of resources, whether or not they need them. Equity, which is, like I said, is different, means having conversations with people, recognizing that each person comes from different backgrounds, comes from different experiences, and the barriers that he, she, or they might face are different. That's a whole lot of words for saying not all Black people are the same. Not all Indigenous people are the same. Not every individual from the 2S LGBTQ plus community is the same. And the only way we know their differences and the supports that we need to provide them as curling clubs is through having conversation with them. Meaningful conversation with them, actively listening, and then being able to provide supports to be able to help them. Let's reflect on those terms for a moment. If our practices, policies, and programs are equitable, they'll be inclusive. If we're being inclusive, it means we will eventually see diversity out on the ice. We will eventually see a population on the ice that's more reflective of our fantastic country. And when all three are working well together, that's when we see belonging. Belonging is the human emotional need to be an accepted member of a group, whether it's through friends, whether it's through religion, whether it's through work, so on and so forth. We all have an inherent need to belong. And if we all have an inherent need to belong, why can't we create those spaces and places within our curling clubs and facilities? I truly believe that everybody in our country should feel a sense of belonging when they walk into the curling club. Let's even take that a step further. I believe that every Canadian belongs within our curling clubs and facilities. And we need to work together to make that happen. As a Black man, when I refer to historically marginalized communities, oftentimes people think I'm referring to race. However, we need to remember that when we talk about historically marginalized communities or underrepresented communities, it's more than just race. We know that those who have a disability typically have a lesser sport experience than those who don't. We know that those who come from rural environments typically have a lesser sport experience than those who come from urban environments. We know that those who come from the 2S LGBTQ plus community typically have a lesser sport experience than those who are straight. When we talk about underrepresented communities, it's a wide range of people and groups. I encourage you to look up Sylvia Ducksworth's Wheel of Power and Privilege to learn a bit more than that. She does a fantastic job diving into that a bit further. Now we're going to talk about bias and privilege. Before we get into definitions, let me just give you an example of bias. Perhaps you turn on this video, perhaps you're watching, and if I immediately sat down in this chair and said, yo, what's up? We're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion today. Maybe not everybody, but most of you are thinking, I don't know what I signed up for, but I don't think it was this. That's our bias at play. Bias is a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc. are better than others, and this usually results in treating people unfairly. So there's all kinds of different biases out there, and I could spend hours and hours and hours talking about those biases, but I really want to dive into two. I want to talk about explicit bias and unconscious bias. So explicit bias refers to the attitudes, beliefs that we have about a person or group on a conscious level. A lot of times these biases can come from a perceived threat. Let me give you an example. My mother is a huge fan of Law and Order. And one of the things that she likes to tell me is back in the day, when Law and Order first came on the air, if there was a black person in the episode, it meant one of two things. It meant either the black person was the criminal, or B, the black person was closely related to the criminal. So perhaps your only interaction with people who look like me is through Law and Order. I can understand why you may have explicit bias towards black people in that particular case. However, it's still biases, and we need to work to mitigate those biases. Next, there's unconscious bias, a form of bias that automatically and unintentionally occurs, but nevertheless affects our judgment and decisions. Sometimes unconscious bias can be disguised as compliments, also known as microaggressions. Microaggressions can show up as asking somebody where they're from, and they tell you, and you say, no, but really, where are you from? Or some microaggressions that I've gotten over time are, you're really well spoken. Who taught you how to talk like that? You don't talk like other black people I've ever met before. Or my absolute favorite is, you're a really good curler for a black person. And that one always gets me. Because number one, if you've ever met another black person who curls, I want to meet them because I got questions for them. Shared experiences, if you will. But if I flip that around and say, thank you, you're a really good curler for an old fat white guy, well, I'm getting kicked out of the club. You see how ridiculous that sounds? That's an example of microaggressions, which we also talk about as unconscious bias. So next, let's talk about privilege. And this isn't about to be a 10-minute conversation about white privilege, because privilege goes so far beyond that. Privilege is a right, immunity, or benefit enjoyed by a particular person or restricted group beyond the advantages of most. Here's the thing about privilege. We all have it. The fact that I can come to you today looking into multiple cameras, looking at notes, wearing my sneakers that my wife swears I overpaid for. That's multiple levels of privilege. I'm not here to say you all have privileges and I don't. So no, it's really not about that. We all have privileges. The thing about our bias and privileges though, it's not about eliminating them. It's about recognizing them and interrupting them. Back when I worked for Nova Scotia Curling as a technical director, I had the privilege of traveling from coast to coast to coast with our provincial junior teams. And in doing that work, we worked with a mental performance consultant. And one of the things she told us was that those emotions that you feel, perhaps it's when you're in the hack, perhaps it's when you miss a shot, perhaps it's when you're thinking about the strategy of the game. All those nervous emotions, if you can name them, we can come up with a plan on how to deal with them. And I believe the same to be true about our own biases and privileges. If we can name them, if we can take time right now and write them down, we can come up with a plan on how to deal with them. So let's talk about countering our bias and privilege. When I worked with Nova Scotia Curling as their technical director, I had the privilege of traveling across the country with our provincial junior teams. In traveling across the country with our provincial junior teams, we had a mental performance consultant. And one of the things that she told us is those emotions that you go through. Perhaps it's when you're sitting in the hack. Perhaps it's when you miss a shot. All those negative emotions. If you can name them, we can come up with a plan on how to deal with them. That's what she would always tell us. And I believe the same to be true about our bias and privileges. So take time right now, perhaps pause this video, and list and name your biases and privileges. Because once you name them, we can come up with a plan on how to deal with them. We must plan with the idea of this plan changing our habits and practices. It's going to feel very uncomfortable at first, but then it will get easier over time. So Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, back in the fall of 2001, they started to do land acknowledgements before their games, before Toronto Raptors games and before Toronto Maple Leafs games. And at first, that caused a whole lot of controversy. But let's think about that today. All professional sports teams now do land acknowledgements before their games. Well, maybe not all, but most. So my question to you today is, what are you going to start to do, perhaps it's next season, perhaps it's next week, that a year from now is going to feel like no big deal at all? Let's talk about allyship. Allyship is somebody who advocates on behalf of a marginalized group who's typically not a part of that group. And when I think about allyship, I divide that into two different categories. I think of active allyship and performative allyship. Performative allyship is something that on the surface appears as allyship, but really it's being done with the primary objective to increase someone's social capital. That's just a whole bunch of words for saying it's doing something to make yourself look good. Perhaps you wear an orange t-shirt on National Truth and Reconciliation Day. But if that's all you do to support Indigenous communities and don't do anything else the other 364 days of the year, that's an example of performative allyship. Now let me be clear. I believe that active allyship can start from a performative space. So perhaps you wear that orange t-shirt and you ask yourself, why is it that we wear an orange t-shirt on this day? And then you learn more about the story behind the orange shirt. And then perhaps that leads to going to our best friend Google and learning more about our Indigenous communities. And then perhaps that leads to a conversation in Truth and Reconciliation. That's how performative allyship can turn to active allyship. Active allyship is someone who actively and intentionally promotes a culture of inclusion. So you might be asking by this point, so what are some actions I can take to be a better ally? Well, first, we need to recognize that this is a lifelong journey. Allyship isn't a degree that you get in university. It's not some golden sticker that you get. It's recognizing that in certain cases, there's some unlearning that we need to do that takes place. It's about willing to act for others in pursuit of ending oppression and creating equality everywhere. Next, we need to intentionally promote a culture of inclusion. Once we learn and educate ourselves, we must take that knowledge and put that into action. Because here's the thing, that racial slur, that microaggression, that homophobic slur, that's just as harmful as falling down on the ice and hitting our head. Obviously, that's physical pain over psychological pain, but the long-term effects are just the same. So my question to you is, as you go into your off season, as you begin your season, whenever you're watching this, ask yourself, what's one thing we can change right now to make our club or our center more inclusive? And start there and go from there. Next, when you see racism or discrimination, call it out. We touched on this a little bit earlier. Let the perpetrator know that that joke, that's not a funny joke. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to get into a fist fight with the perpetrator. You obviously don't want to put yourself into harm's way, but perhaps it's reporting to the right authorities that something has taken place. Perhaps it's showing empathy, not sympathy, because those are two different things, but showing empathy to the person on the receiving end. Simply asking, are you okay? I saw what has happened. That's terrible. That goes a long way towards being a better ally. Next, broaden your social groups. Start to connect with people who are unlike you. Step outside your comfort zone. Remember what we talked about earlier. We need to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Listen deeply to others when hearing their stories, when asking them questions. Actively listen. Don't listen to respond, because that's historically what we do as human beings in general. But actively listen. And when we actively listen, that information that we're getting, that story that we're being told, build that in to create spaces and places where everybody can truly be their authentic self. Next, educate yourself. Be proactive rather than reactive. Perhaps it's using our friend Google, like we talked about earlier. Perhaps it's following individuals, thought leaders on social media. Perhaps it's going to the library to pick up some books or going online to listen to an audiobook. Take time to educate yourself. Really step outside your comfort zone. But when we talk about educating ourselves, it's important to remember to not just rely on those from historically marginalized communities to educate ourselves. As a Black person, this is what I do. I educate in this space. I enjoy doing it. But we need to remember, not every Black person, not every Indigenous person, not every queer person wants to have to retell their story over and over again to help your education. It's what I like to refer to as inclusion tax. Perhaps something traumatizing has happened, and the last thing we want to do is to have an individual relive that trauma in order to educate ourselves. And then lastly, we need to accept feedback. So when we talk about accepting feedback, perhaps we use a word or a term that was once okay that is no longer okay. Don't fold your arms and say, well, I've always used that term and I will continue to use that term. No, take this as an opportunity to educate yourself. Take this as an opportunity to apologize and work to do better next time. Listen, we're all going to make mistakes in this space, but it's about learning from that, because it's not only about being a better person. It's not only about being a better ally. It's about creating an even better curling facility. So lastly, let's just wrap up with some different things to consider when working with underrepresented or historically marginalized communities. The first thing that you need to do is we need to clean our own house first. There needs to be an acknowledgement of the actual problems of racism and discrimination within sport. And there needs to be a real acknowledgement as curling facilities, we need to do a better job. Again, that doesn't mean that all curlers are discriminatory, all curlers are racist, whatever ism you want to use there. But we recognize that across sport, we need to do a better job to welcome those who've historically been marginalized into our facility. Next, we need to never forget that other communities aren't the problem, and that other communities aren't a problem to be solved. We want to take our spaces and places, in our case, curling clubs and centers, to make them more welcoming for all, because again, it all goes back to that belonging that we talked about earlier. Next, developing trust is absolutely crucial. At the end of the day, communities, no matter what community they come from, if they historically have not been in your curling facility, they're not going to go to your curling facility if they don't trust you. And just like anything, whether we're buying a car, whether we're buying or selling a house, there needs to be trust developed there in order to advance forward, or in the case of buying a house, in order to close the sale, if you will. And we need to also remember that building trust takes time. This isn't something that just automatically happens within an off season. With the Black Rock Initiative, we started programming in the winter of 2021. We had conversations with community for 6 to 9 months before that. That's what I mean when I talk about building trust. It's showing up in community multiple times. It's having conversations. You know what building trust starts with? It starts with asking the question, what does curling look like to your community? And I want you to think about this. So long as little Johnny or little Susie aren't hurting themselves or somebody else, what difference does it make if that curling program looks completely different than anything else you've ever offered? Remember, like we talked about earlier, we need to actively listen and we need to accept feedback as well. With the Black Rock Initiative, we ran a program for Indigenous youth. And we started with floor curl sets, care of Rock Solid Productions. When we ran that program, the first night we ran the program, we had 2 little girls show up. And I had hoped for that number to be higher, of course, but we had a blast anyway with those kids. Well, when their uncle came to pick them up, he said, "I think what you're doing here is awesome. However, it's a shame that you're having this on the same night as the intro to drumming session next door." So we realized that part of the problem was we had it on the same night as something else in the community that was more culturally significant to them. So we changed the date, we changed the time, we took that feedback, and over time our numbers increased. So as I'm getting to the end of my presentation, I want you to take a moment to self-reflect. I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, based on this conversation that we've had today, what's one thing I'm going to start to do? Based on this conversation today, what's one thing you're going to stop doing? And based on this conversation today, what's one thing you're going to continue to do? Because here's the thing about this presentation. I want you to think about it as me giving you a pair of sneakers. You can take those sneakers and you can chuck them in your closet, never to be seen again. Or you can put on those sneakers and perhaps go for a walk. Or you can take those sneakers and go run and train for a marathon. There's 2 things to remember here. Ultimately, what you do with those sneakers, ultimately what you do with those conversations, it's not based on what I've said or done. It's based on what you do. Don't ever forget that there are multiple people out here to help you in these spaces or places. I fully recognize that entering the space can be very scary. But whether it's myself or another inclusion consultant, we are here to help. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if you want to learn more about the subject. If you want to have more of a conversation, you can Google the Black Rock Initiative to find information about ourselves. You can also find me on all the different social media channels. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have an awesome day.